of our Global Resilience Research Network. I'm Steve Flynn. I'm the founding director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University, and a little bit about the Global Resilience Research Network for those who may be new to this as a result of this very topical and important conversation we're going to be having today. About 5 years ago, the Global Resilience Institute was launched at Northeastern University as a university-wide initiative to bring together folks from all the different disciplines to attack the challenge of building greater infrastructure systems and community and ultimately societal resilience. And critical infrastructure resilience is one of our key focus areas. And realizing that we'd still be at a drop in the bucket, given the urgency and the challenge and the complexity of trying to advance that mission, we've reached out and now built a network of 40 universities and research institutes internationally as a part of the Global Resilience Research Network. And this is one of our activities, which is to engage periodically around topical issues that really reflect some of our members' expertise or can inform some of that work that's going forward. So really delighted to have today with us here Tom Popik, who I've had the good fortune to know for a number of years. And Tom is the chairman and president of the Foundation for Resilient Societies, based out of New Hampshire. He's been focusing on the issue of critical infrastructure, particularly the power grid resilience for virtually his entire career before it was fashionable. Tom is a graduate of mechanical engineering at MIT. He came out of that program at the same time I came out of the Coast Guard Academy a bunch of years ago, went into the US Air Force, and has played a really important role in bringing and efforts to get the industry, to get regulators and others aware of some of the challenges connected with making our power grid not just reliable, but resilient, better, more secure, better able to handle disruptions and so forth. And his attention is international, and he really brings to us a very current set of insights about what's going on in the Ukraine with respect to the power grid and the energy sector. And we're really, really excited to have you here with us, Tom. And if you can, maybe also give folks a little bit of context about just putting this presentation together and what got you doing it here for the first over the last 2+ weeks. And I'll just say to all our audience here, what we're going to do is Tom is going to spend about a half hour giving you the latest, literally tells me updated from this morning's information. And then we'll do a bit of a open up for Q&A. And we have, of course, the chat that you could drop your questions in or observations along the way. And also that hand raising function when we get to that point in the presentation. But we have just under an hour now left, and really excited to hear from you, Tom.
Steve, thank you so much for that introduction. Tabor French, our analyst, and I are really excited to be here to give this presentation. I'll give a little bit of background. We started researching the Ukrainian electric grid about a week after the Russian invasion. We've given this presentation 3 times previously to various audiences. And what we've done each time that we present, we update the presentation. So what you're going to see today is material that is current as of this morning. We've actually gotten real-time indicators of the infrastructure status of Ukraine. And a big part of what we're doing here is not reported on the cable news networks or on the television networks. There's several reasons for that. Some of the things we're going to talk about today are technical, and other things don't really resonate as much as some of the human interest stories. And so Tabor and I really look forward to giving you what I'll call an alternative view into what's been going on with the energy sector in Ukraine. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and you folks should be able to, in just a moment, to see the first slide of my presentation. So, Steve, you can see my.
Okay, that's great.
Okay, wonderful. So the title of the presentation is Ukraine's Electric Grid During the Russian Invasion. It's dated today. This is what I'm going to be talking about, the executive summary, and then we'll talk about how the Ukrainian grid is configured, the transmission, control, and synchronization. We'll go into quite a bit of detail about the generation plants and their energy sources. I'll review some grid disruptions during the Russian invasion. Then I'll talk about real-time indicators of Ukrainian infrastructure status. It's amazing in the internet era that we can look at these. And then I'll conclude with some summary observations before we have our question and answer session. For the executive summary, Ukraine has a modern interconnected and synchronized electric grid with a system frequency of 50 hertz. Here in the United States, we're at 60 hertz, but they're at 50 hertz. The Ukrainian grid is remarkably modern. In many ways, it's more modern than the US grid, especially in the very high voltage lines, the ultra high voltage lines at 750 kilovolts. They have transformer substations and all sorts of transmission as we do here in the United States. They have a single transmission system operator, Ukrenergo. I'm going to have trouble with some of the pronunciation, but I think I got that right. And then, like here in the United States, they have regional distribution providers or local electric utilities. They have a regulated wholesale electricity market. That means that they have companies that sell electricity. They have a daily auction process for their grid. This is a really important aspect. They have a relay protected grid. You may say, what is that? Well, a relay in a grid is essentially a very sophisticated surge protection device. And that surge protection or relay protects the large transformers at the substations, as well as the spinning generators in the grid. But this protection also makes the grid susceptible to what's called cascading collapse or a domino effect. So what will happen at any point in time, the generation has to balance precisely with the load. And if there is a relay that trips, then that load has to immediately adjust. If there's not enough shock absorption capacity in the grid, you can get this domino effect where multiple relays or surge protectors start tripping off, and that produces a collapse. We have some very exciting and recent news. On March 16th, the Ukrainian grid was synchronized with the Western European grid. And I'll give you more details about that in a bit. The Ukrainian grid has a wide diversity of energy sources, nuclear, about 50% of generation, coal, about a quarter. They also have natural gas, hydroelectric, and renewables. It's amazing, but there's been continued electric reliability during the invasion. We'll go into some of the potential reasons for that later. There's been few attacks on generation plants and substations. A major disincentive for attacks is interruption of cross-border natural gas pipelines. So it turns out that Russia sells a lot of gas to Western Europe, and that gas transits Ukraine's network. If the war persists, we expect to see growing nuclear safety issues and also issues with the fossil fuel supply for some of the generation plants. So now I'm going to go into some detail about the transmission, control, and synchronization of the Ukrainian grid. What you're looking at here is a graphic of high voltage transmission lines in Ukraine. You can see it's a network. There are hubs where there are generation facilities or transmission switch yards, but there's also connections to other electric grids. And so you can see this area over here to the right of the graphic, or to the east, that's Russia. You can see these transmission lines that connect major metropolitan areas like Kharkiv or Donetsk in Ukraine over to Russia. You can also see that there's a connection over here to Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. And then this very important transmission line that I'm going to talk about more in just a bit that goes from a nuclear power complex over into Poland. So again, this graphic shows a network. This network is very similar to what we would see regionally in the United States. However, there are a significant number of ultra-high voltage transmission lines in Ukraine. We rarely see that in the United States. There's just a few in the Midwest. And so you could make the case that in many ways, the Ukraine grid is more modern than even the US grid. This is a picture of the Ukrenergo transmission control room. It looks very much like a transmission control room would in the United States. You can see the grid operators at these consoles here in the foreground. This wall in the background is a chart of the generation plants in Ukraine, the transmission lines, the major load centers. Up here on the right, you can see the local time, and then this other display would be the system frequency, and that's reading 49.99, which is very close to the 50 hertz that their grid optimally runs at. It's the name of the transmission system operator for Ukraine is Ukrenergo. It's amazing to me, but they have been publishing videos on YouTube since the Russian attack. So this video is dated March 2nd, 2022. It shows one of the grid operators saying the armed forces of Ukraine and civilian consumers have electricity, and this is certainly true. If you want to do more investigation on your own about what's happening in Ukraine, you can go right to YouTube and you can look at these videos, and they will have English subtitles, and it's a remarkable resource. Just to explain how the European electric grids work, this is a frequency map of the European electric grids. They operate at 50 hertz. However, they're not all synchronized. So there's one big Western European grid that goes from Spain up through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, over to Turkey. It abuts the Ukraine grid here, all of Italy. So all of this Western European grid is on one frequency. You can see the United Kingdom has another frequency. They have a direct current tie that goes over the channel, but they're at their own frequency. And then you can see the Scandinavian countries have their own frequency as well. How do we get this data? Well, there's a research service, FNet, at the University of Tennessee, and they have these monitors that are installed around the world that report on the grid frequency. And so what we're really seeing here with the colors is the deviation from the optimal grid frequency. And then there's no data reported for Russia. And then you see Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, no data reported here at the time that, well, even this morning, but at the time that FNet took these frequencies. So I wanted to just show that to give a bit of a context of how the European grids are configured. Big accomplishment. The Ukraine grid is now synchronized with the Western European grid as of March 16th. So I'll give some background on this. What you see here in the center is the Ukraine grid. You can see a lot of the distribution lines. This is a very granular display. Previously, the Ukraine grid had been synchronized with Belarus and especially with Russia. The Ukrainians wanted to move their grid away from Russian synchronization because literally the Russians could disrupt their grid and make it synchronized with Western Europe. Already there's the Burstin power island, which had been synchronized with Western Europe, the Slovak Republic, Hungary, and Romania. But as of March 16th, well, I'll even give you a little bit more background. On the day of the attack by Russia, Ukraine entered a 3-day test period where they so-called islanded their grid. And so on the day of the attack, Ukraine disconnected from Russia and started operating their grid with their own frequency control on their own. The attack occurred only 4 hours after the islanding of the Ukrainian grid. Now let's think about that a moment. The islanding was scheduled way in advance. Is it a coincidence that the attack occurred only 4 hours after the beginning of the islanding? I would say maybe not, because if you think about it a moment, if the Ukrainian grid were to have a cascading collapse, that collapse might propagate back into Russia. And so the Russians, by waiting until the Ukrainian grid was disconnected from the Russian grid, gave themselves a bit of protection against that collapse propagation. For several weeks then, Ukraine operated independently, but as of yesterday, the Ukrainian grid has been synchronized with the Western European grid through this transmission line that you see right here. There's a lot of advantages to that. One of them is there's additional shock absorption or surge absorption in the Ukrainian grid now if a major transmission line or generation plant trips off. So the Ukrainian grid is going to be much more reliable now that it's linked in to the much larger Western European grid. You may say, well, how are they able to do that so quickly? Well, this is a very advanced 750 kV transmission line that was left over from the Soviet era and not built anew, but simply reactivated. So it's fascinating what has happened just within the past day in terms of the Ukrainian grid and its synchronization. I'll now go into the generation plants, and you folks may want to mute if there's a little background noise. Thank you. So I'll go into the generation plants and energy sources. This data here, Tabor helped me collect and analyze this data. We have two graphics. The left-hand graphic is the Ukraine generation capacity by the energy source. And on the right-hand graphic, we show the actual generation or consumption, because generation will always equal consumption by energy source too. So I'll go over the left-hand graphic. About 24% of the capacity for Ukraine's grid, which is 56 gigawatts in 2020, is nuclear, 43% coal, 9% natural gas, 8% hydro. They have some renewable resources, wind and solar PV. But as I'll show you in the next graphic, those really don't account for very much of the actual generation. So in 2020, the actual generation was 53% nuclear, 30% coal, 8% natural gas, 5% hydro, and then just a little bit of renewables, the wind and the solar PV. So this really is the two fundamental viewpoints of how you look at generation resources in a grid. How much capacity do you have? How much is actually generated? And then what are the energy sources for the generation plants? This next graphic shows capacity factors by energy source. So you may say, well, what is a capacity factor? Well, the capacity factor is the actual amount of generation over a time period, for example, a year, this is 2020, divided by the theoretic capacity of that generation source. And so here on the left, you see 64% capacity factor for nuclear. That means the nuclear plants in Ukraine over 2020 operated at a little less than 2/3 of their theoretical maximum. Coal, 21%, natural gas, 25%, hydro, 19%, wind, 16%, and the solar PV, very low, probably because a lot of those solar PV plants just coming online, so they weren't online most of the year. If you were to compare these capacity factors to the United States, the nuclear would be over 90%. Coal in many places is used as baseload, and that would be, say, 85%. But in Ukraine, they're using the coal plants for what's called peaking. The consumption of electricity is not constant over the whole 24-hour period of a day. And so you would have the nuclear as baseload, and then you would have the coal and the natural gas and the hydro that would be so-called peaking capacity. Very important information on Ukraine's fossil fuel sources. So coal, 45% of the coal supply is imported. Of the imported coal, 70% is from Russia. Russia stopped coal deliveries in November 2021. There were emergency deliveries from South Africa and the US in December and January. On February 28th, one of the big utilities in Ukraine estimated 15 to 20 days of coal reserves. Natural gas, another important fuel, 30% of Ukraine's natural gas is imported. They also have gas fields. The imported gas comes mainly from Western Europe, but a lot of it is gas that comes from Russia and then is turned back around and goes back to Ukraine. There's massive natural gas storage facilities in Ukraine. Then refined petroleum, 70% before the war, 70% had been supplied from Belarus and Russian refineries. There's only one operating Ukrainian refinery. The storage capacity of refined petroleum products in Ukraine is a state secret. You can see why, because they're dependent on these refineries in Belarus and Russia. This graphic here shows Ukraine's coal-fired generation plants. On the eastern half of the country, a lot of those plants depend on coal supplies from Russia. This is a great graphic from the Euromaidan press, and a lot of that is hard coal. The softer coal operates the plants in the western part of the country, and some of that is mined in Ukraine, and then also some of that coal comes from Poland. Then there also can be coal that can be imported, as shown here in the bottom part of the graphic. So reliability of coal supplies during the war is going to be quite critical. The coal supplies from Russia have already been shut off. And so we would expect a lot of these generation plants over here in the east to run out of coal at some point. As far back as December, there was an energy war with Russia. So this is a article that was in the Euromaidan press, and I'll just read the headline. Amid Russian energy war, government denies expert warnings that Ukraine may face electricity and heating cuts. So there was a long lead up in the energy sector to the attack. There was an attempt by the Russians to deprive the Ukrainians of energy resources and to also to move the coal stockpiles lower before the war. I'll now transition over to Ukraine's nuclear power plants. There are 4 plant locations and 15 different reactors. This Zaporizhzhia plant here in the south, that's the one that was attacked by mortar or or artillery by the Russian forces. The plant sustained some damage, and it's currently under control of Russian forces. These other 3 plants are currently generating power for Ukraine. A little bit of background about Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Again, 15 nuclear reactors at 4 plant locations, 13.1 gigawatts. As of March 16th, approximately 5 gigawatts of electricity was being generated by nuclear reactors, and that is a significant part of their load. They're Soviet-designed reactors. They have good steel and concrete containment, unlike the reactors at Chernobyl. Like the reactors in the United States, they use zirconium-clad rods for reactor fuel. The fuel had been supplied by Russia. It's a pending transition to the US supplier Westinghouse. The plants have spent fuel pools too. So once the rods no longer are used in the reactor, they're very hot still, and they go into these water-filled pools. The pools require electric power for cooling. But if there's no electric power, the water will boil off, and you can get what's called a zirconium fire, and radioactive plumes can result from that, which would be a disaster of really unprecedented proportions in the nuclear sector. Also, without water for radiation shielding, the spent fuel pools become really highly radioactive, and they can't be approached. I'll briefly go through Ukraine's natural gas and fuel oil generation plants. They're mostly in the larger cities, such as Kyiv or Kharkiv. They're combined heat and power plants in many cases where they produce electricity, and then they also produce steam for district heating in the cities. Fortunately, Ukraine has really massive natural gas storage facilities. This is a map of the facilities in the European Union along with their capacities. And you can see this really big circle over here in Ukraine, and they have about 31 billion cubic meters of gas storage, which you can see is the largest of any country in Europe here. Ukraine's hydropower plants, they're mostly, as you would expect, along rivers. And so you can see there's a couple major rivers in Ukraine, one that has these plants starting in Kyiv and then going down to the coast. And then there's another river over here with some plants. These hydropower plants are very helpful for peaking. So when there's a evening load increase, those plants can start producing electricity. So what Tabor was able to do is try and parse out the generation capacity in Ukraine that is energy resilient and also not in Russian controlled territory. And so what Tabor was able to do, looking at a number of sources, is put these red lines in, and this shows approximately the extent of the Russian advance. And then you can see these plants over here, some along the rivers, and then you can see several nuclear plants, 1, 2, 3, and some of the coal plants over here in Western Ukraine. What we tried to do is say, okay, which plants have coal supplies that would come from Ukraine or come from Poland, and which plants are within the areas controlled by the government of Ukraine, and where are the nuclear plants. You can see all this with the legend here. And then we quantified things. So we made a ranking of all the plants that were energy resilient in regions controlled by the government of Ukraine as of today. We compared that to the peak evening load on March 6th, which is the most recent data we could get. And what you can see here is the total capacity is about 19 gigawatts and the peak load around 14 gigawatts. And so there's still a good amount of slack capacity, according to our calculations, within the Ukrainian electricity sector, which is good news. And this explains why, when you look at CNN or the television networks, why when people are interviewed, the lights are on in Ukraine. It's really amazing. They had a lot of excess capacity in their grid, and now that excess capacity is really coming in handy. I'll briefly go through some grid disruptions during the Russian invasion. There haven't been many. This graphic here shows the Russian-controlled areas and the Russian advances as of the 5th of March. There have been blackouts in Sumy and Mariupol. So you can see those cities right here. Here's Mariupol. That's in the news quite a bit because that's come under a lot of Russian bombing and shelling, and there's been very unfortunate civilian casualties there. And then also some blackouts in Sumy. But what's been incredible is that there, for the most part, there haven't been large-scale blackouts throughout the Ukrainian electric grid. And here you can see the Zaporizhzhia power plant. That's the nuclear power plant that was captured by Russian forces. This is a picture taken by the security cameras of the attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That happened on March 3rd. Again, the shelling was somewhat indiscriminate. It impacted one of the containment vessels. The damage was not severe, and then also caused a fire in one of the administrative buildings, which you can see over here to the left. This next chart or graphic is very, very important. It shows the interdependence of the gas transmission by Gazprom, that's the Russian gas company, to Western Europe, and the Ukrenergo pipelines. You can see that there's this enormous collection and transmission network for natural gas in Russia. You can also see there are multiple pipelines that cross Ukraine's territory right here, and then go into transmission and distribution systems in Western Europe. You can also see the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So the politics of this was that Russia didn't want to be dependent on the Ukrainian utility for selling their natural gas to Europe. So they built an undersea pipeline right here that would also avoid the Ukrainian transit fees. They also built a second pipeline, Nord Stream 2, but that's never gone into operation because of the sanctions during the war. I'll now briefly go through some indicators of Ukrainian infrastructure status. It's just amazing in the internet era that we can look at these indicators. This is from Blue Fire Studios. It's a very small software development company that monitors outages mostly in the North American grid, but they've started covering Ukraine. The big point here is there's about 14 million metered customers in Ukraine, and you can actually see the number of outages by the regional areas. They're called oblasts in Ukraine. You can see these outages are relatively small. So if you total them all up, it would be someplace a few 100,000 out of 14 million. So this is a great indicator that the Ukrainian grid really has not had that many outages. And this is very current data. This screenshot was taken this morning on the 17th at around 9 o'clock Eastern time. This is a press release from DTEC about returning electricity to 5,000 families in the Donetsk region. So the grid has gone down, some of it due to attacks, some to do other things during the conflict. And the utility workers have been out there, in some cases risking their lives to get the power back up and running. And so you can see that from this press release. So this is one of the real-time indicators of what's happening in the Ukrainian grid. Here's another indicator. It's my favorite. It's IODA monitoring of the Ukrainian internet traffic. So how does this work? Well, throughout Ukraine, there are routers. And you may say, well, what's a router? Well, that device that you get your internet in your home is a router. But there's also many more industrial routers throughout the internet. So what the folks at now Georgia Tech have done is they have mapped the IP blocks and the routers in the internet throughout the world, and they constantly ping. They send out a signal called a ping to these routers, and then see if they get an active response. And they can compare the number of active responses that they had gotten previously before the conflict to what they're getting now. And you can actually see this little pop-up here for this active probing. It's at 85% of what had been previously mapped. And so that's quite incredible. We have this real-time indicator that the internet infrastructure, which is also dependent on the electric grid, is at about 85% of what it was before the invasion. This bottom indicator is also very interesting. You can see it goes up and down. It actually goes up and down in a daily cycle. And this is monitoring of misaddressed IP packets. And so if you ever send an email to someone, but you misaddress it, that becomes part of the so-called background radiation of the internet. And that can be monitored. And you would expect more people to be sending misdirected internet traffic during the daylight hours in Ukraine during the evening. And that's why you see this up and down cycle by day. Again, this is a really current source of infrastructure status. You can go to our website, www.resiliencesocieties.org, and right there on our homepage, there's a link to the folks at Georgia Tech who do this kind of monitoring. And what they do is just a remarkable public service. They don't charge anything for the monitoring. I'll finish up with Flight Radar 24. Some of you probably have heard about this. This is a Swedish company that monitors airplanes around the world based on their transponders. So all airplanes have a radio transmitter that continually sends out a signal identifying the aircraft. There are ground stations around the world this company has put in place. They use the electric grid for power, and they use the internet for reporting back to the Flight Radar 24 headquarters. You can see first of all, you can see is that there's a lot more air traffic in Hungary and Romania than there is in Ukraine. That's number one. But you can still see these blue dots, and these are the reporting stations in Ukraine, and they wouldn't be reporting if they didn't have internet connectivity and grid power. Again, a great indication of current status in Ukraine. So I'll just finish up with some summary observations. Russia's attack on Ukraine, certainly unprecedented in the modern era. It's a besieged country with a wide area and synchronized electric grid. The nuclear power sector before the attack supplied over 50% of the electricity. The telecommunications, the internet, interdependent with the electric grid, the cross-border natural pipelines, which are supplying Western Europe with Russian gas, also interdependent. What we see is not yet the society-wide total war of World War II. There have been few attacks on the Ukrainian electric grid and continued reliable operation for the most part. So you may say, well, why is this? And so what we would do is we would propose 4 different incentives that the Russians would have to preserve the grid infrastructure. Probably the most important is continued transmission of Russian gas to European customers. There's also prevention of cascading grid collapse and a risky black start. Black start is when the whole grid is without generation, and there are certain plants, so-called black start plants, that then have to start the grid up. It's impossible to test that operation or practice that operation in normal times because it would require taking down the grid. So it's very risky to undertake that, especially during wartime conditions. I personally think that the Russians had the intent of capturing Ukraine with the infrastructure intact. If that is their intent, then it would also make sense that they want to avoid a grid collapse, because a grid collapse can damage certain grid components that have very long lead times for replacement, sometimes 1 or 2 or even more than that years. So if you need to replace a extra high voltage transformer, that lead time would be 1 to 2 years. Also for the generators at the electricity generation plants. And then finally, because the electric grid has continued to operate reliably in Ukraine, it is helping to avert a humanitarian disaster in a country with a population of 44 billion. So again, this is some of the research that Tabor French and I have been able to do. And at this point, we'd be really interested to hear people's perspectives and questions on what we've shown.
Well, Tom, thank you for that. That's just tremendous amount of useful information, and not something we're hearing from the major media sources. Not surprisingly, that there's a technical challenge of explaining these things, but you do it so skillfully. So I think for our audience, even those with more general background, have a much greater understanding about how the energy grid works and how it can be disrupted, and why in this case it's still going. One of our axioms at the Global Resilience Institute is a disaster is a terrible thing to waste, as particularly when it comes to trying to understand risk associated with complex interdependent systems. It's often difficult to model and understand risk to those before we see it play itself out. And so when you have a real world incident like this, where we actually have an attack going on and the system having to cope with it, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. It strikes me that some of the ones just right away relative to the US grid, things that stood out were one that you said, to some extent, the system is more modern than the US system, and also that there was a substantial amount of extra capacity in the system that therefore could basically be able to allow it to adjust to disruptions that may happen in different geographic locations or within different power generation sources. do I have that right, that our grid may be more vulnerable than the Ukrainian grid if put under similar kinds of stresses?
I'd be hesitant to say our grid is more vulnerable. I would observe that we have three interconnections within the continental United States, the eastern, the western, and then Texas, which is ERCOT. Those larger interconnections have more what I'll call shock absorption capacity if there's an accidental trip. But it's interesting. If there's a generation plant that would trip off, say in Maine, that can be observed down in Florida, and there's oscillations that go through the grid. So generally the larger grids are more resilient. The Ukrainian grid, when it was in island mode, would have been less resilient, but now that it's connected to the Western European grid, it's recovered some of that resiliency. So I would just say the general principle is that the larger grids tend to be more resilient, but they're also susceptible to the cascading collapse.
Great. Well, thanks for that. Just one of the questions that was put here in the chat by David Pine was about the cyber offensive. And I think you speak to that a little bit, perhaps by, this summary observation about the Russian incentives to put the grid, to preserve potentially the grid infrastructure. But the cyber physical risks to the grid, or at least being talked about that, have you been surprised that there hasn't been more on that side of things with regard to the Russian invasion? And is that something that still we need to keep a real eye on?
Yes, it is a surprise that there's been at least no successful large-scale cyber attack on the Ukrainian grid. There were small-scale cyber attacks on the Ukrainian grid by the Russians, both in 2015 and 2016. It's been said that the Ukrainian grid has been a laboratory for electric grid cyber attack for the Russians. But what we see is that there hasn't been a successful cyber attack on a large scale or physical attack on a large scale in the Ukrainian grid up to this point in time. And we really have to question the reasons for that. But I would say they probably have to do with some of the incentives I have at the bottom of this summary page.
Okay, very good. Melissa Hancock has asked about is there a separate, essentially, communication system independent of the grid that the Ukraine military is able to operate from? How dependent basically is the defense apparatus of the Ukraine on the civilian power grid, civilian communications and internet?
That's a really great question. Here in the United States, many of the electric utilities have developed their own proprietary telecommunication system so that grid reliability will be enhanced. It's not universal, but many of the larger utilities have done that. I'm not aware of how the telecommunication system works for the Ukrainian grid. I do know it's a SCADA controlled grid, supervisory control and data acquisition, which means that there's a central control room, and then there's telecommunications signals that are sent out to the various substations and generation plants to dispatch and switch the power around. I would also say that anecdotally, I've heard that the Russian invaders have been dependent upon the Ukrainian infrastructure, the Ukrainian telecommunications infrastructure, to coordinate their operations. So they may be using cell phones or in some cases the internet even as part of their military operations. That could provide yet another incentive to keep the Ukrainian infrastructure up and running.
Okay, great. Michael Jones is asking about the hard coal versus soft coal. Is it equal to, I'm not sure if I get here, bituminous versus lignite? This is exceeding my technical understanding.
Well, I'm not too good with how to pronounce the coal names, but the hard coal is, I think, the anthracite, and the softer coal is bituminous, I believe, which would be in the western part of Ukraine. And there's a half a dozen major different types of coal, lignite and all that. And I'm not a coal expert, but again, it's mostly the hard coal in the east that's mined in Donetsk or by the Russians, and the softer coal in the west.
And if I can jump in as well, through part of my research, I came to discover that the coal that is actually mined in eastern Ukraine is quite poor quality, which leads to a diminished generation. It's just not good quality compared to coal elsewhere in the world.
Very good. And maybe relative to, is there a shoe to drop here? Because you did mention about that the stockpile of the coal reserves are in the 20 or so days. Are they drawing that down in the last 3 weeks? So we have just a week to go, or how do we understand that reserve issue and what the impact that may have on the coal plants?
Certainly, that's one of the things that I'm intensely curious about as well. So here in the United States, the coal stockpiles at the beginning of the winter typically are 60 to 90 days. They were just a few weeks at the beginning of the conflict, and the Ukrainians were trying to build up the coal stocks despite the Russians having cut off their coal imports as of about the 1st of November. What we don't know, we know that at least one of the utilities was reporting about 2 weeks of coal supply at the beginning of March, on February 28th, actually. But what we don't know is how successful the mining and resupply operations for coal have been, especially in the western part of Ukraine. So I think that's still an open issue.
Okay, great. One of the questions that Jack Boswell asked about, what's your sense about the attack on the first nuclear plant, and giving there seemingly this incentives to preserve the grid infrastructure, why have they gone after the nuclear power plant?
Well, they've gone after 2 nuclear facilities. They captured Chernobyl, which is a risky thing to do because—
And there's no power generation though coming from Chernobyl, right?
Well, that's correct. There's no power generation, but there's spent fuel pools at Chernobyl. Now, from the original Chernobyl fuel that was littered around the reactor after the fire, a lot of that has really cooled down. But Chernobyl is also to be the site of the centralized spent fuel storage facility for Ukraine. And there's some question as to how much spent fuel was actually transferred around Chernobyl before the attack. If you listen to what the Ministry of Energy is saying in Ukraine, they're saying with some urgency that there needs to be reliable power supply to the Chernobyl region, which would imply that there are still hot fuel assemblies in Chernobyl, not from the Chernobyl plant, but potentially from others. But again, that's an open question. As far as the Zaporizhzhia a power plant in the south, there probably was a Russian intent to capture that plant. It stopped generating electricity since its capture, but the actual execution of the attack may have been inept. Shelling a operating nuclear power plant is an extraordinarily risky thing to do. Cold shutdown, as it's called, may not be achieved, and there may be reactor meltdowns. And so I think that the capture of that plant was done in a very heavy-handed way that certainly wasn't prudent, and certainly has alarmed the governments of Western Europe about what could be a repeat of radiation release such as we saw in Chernobyl.
I mean, one of the things that's potentially brought to the fore after Fukushima, right? Many Europeans, particularly the Germans, backed out of nuclear power, creating more dependency on fossil fuels, largely coming from Russia. Now maybe rethinking that and perhaps getting back into nuclear generation. But when the nuclear plants themselves are being targeted by the adversary, it seems like it's making the risk balance ideas here pretty challenging here for the Western Europeans.
I think that the Western Europeans are in an energy shortage right now. They have become increasingly reliable on renewable resources, which are also intermittent resources, or in the parlance of electric grid operation, non-dispatchable resources. It means when the evening load peak comes, you can't tell the wind to blow harder, and you can't get the sun to start shining again. And that's why dispatchable power such as nuclear power is important. And that's the challenge for the Western Europeans. They would they transitioned away from dispatchable or even baseload nuclear power to dispatchable natural gas fired power, but a lot of that natural gas has been coming from Russia.
Okay, very good. I think I've got through the questions here that were in the chat. Well, somebody asked about slides being made available. I think we're going to be posting this, posting the presentation on our site, so certainly be able to get access to that too here. But suggest anybody reach out directly to you, Tom, if you want to get a hold of the slides.
Well, certainly, you folks will make them public, and we're proud of the slides, and we'll make them public too. I will say that what we're doing is it's a challenging thing. We didn't know too much about the Ukrainian grid before we started, so we may not have gotten every detail right, but I think we got the general thrust of what's going on in Ukraine correctly, and we're updating the presentation as events progress.
Right. I mean, I was trying to, I guess, nudge a little bit in this direction, but I wonder if you might hear, given that you have focused heavily on the U.S. Energy systems and our own resilience, are there things that are lessons learned that you're driving here that might inform, how we think about the security, the reliability, the resilience of the U.S. energy systems? And in our case, we don't expect a Russian invasion, but cyber physical is an ongoing risk, and attacks on the grid that way. Other just how maybe has this event of in tracking it here perhaps affected your thinking or reinforced some of the thoughts you've had about how we get to a better place on the U.S. energy system?
Certainly, that is a great question, because what we see happening in Ukraine, the grid can only be resilient if the grid has resilient energy sources. We need to start looking at what is the stockpile of energy that is at generation plants. So, for example, in Ukraine, one of the problems that they had, or that they're having right now, is low fuel stockpiles at the coal-fired plants. Now, they have quite a bit of stockpiles of natural gas because they have a large natural gas facility. The nuclear plants have several years of energy inherent in the reactor cores. So we can see that one of the reasons the Ukrainian grid has been resilient is that they have a very high proportion of nuclear power. So it's in normal times, it's about 50%. In the United States, it's about 20% nuclear power in normal times. So in that dimension, in terms of fuel that is stored on site at generation plants, I think that I could say definitively the US electric grid is less resilient than the Ukrainian grid. It's becoming more true if we depend on intermittent sources such as wind. So, for example, wind in Texas is a large percentage of their generation. I'm going to ask Tabor to look that up for us, and he can tell us over the past year what percent of Texas was wind. When you start depending on these intermittent sources, then it becomes even more important to have stored energy or fuel stockpiled at the dispatchable generation plants. So again, Steve, it's a great question, but we see the Ukrainian grid being resilient, and we know that the US grid, in case of some kind of a disturbance or a disruption or even an attack, we would hope it would be resilient too if those energy and fuel supply chains were to be disrupted, and we needed to operate the grid without resupply for a period of time.
Okay. Do you have a sense, is there anything process underway within the industry or within the regulators that is looking for the kind of lessons learned out of the Ukrainian invasion that could inform back to the U.S.? Are you flying solo on this effort to understand what's happening? What's happening in the context of the Ukraine and what we might learn from it?
Well, I wouldn't say we're flying solo. I think Tabor had gotten that answer for us about the proportion of wind in Texas. Tabor, did you have that?
Yeah, around 20% of Texas generation is wind.
Right, and that's a large percent. So, well, no, we're not on a solo mission for promoting resilience of the U.S. electric grid. there was a very important rulemaking proceeding back in 2000, and it would have been 2017 and going into 2018 at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that would have compensated electric generation plants for having fuel stored on site at the plants. And I will say with some pride that we were a key participant in that proceeding. And when the FERC commissioners voted against those resilient energy sources at the plants, we were the only group to file an appeal. It's called a request for rehearing. So we were intimately involved in that docket. And we continue to try and get the message out that if we don't have resilient generation and resilient fuel supplies here in the US, when unexpected events occur, or sometimes even the potential deliberate attack, we don't want to be learning that very hard lesson in real time. We want to prepare well in advance.
Well, thank you so much for that, Tom, and thanks for the great service you're doing and your organization, and really appreciate this updated here at the table. Thank you for all the research and efforts that went into getting this together here. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Kathleen Fleischauer and Daniela Ricon-Riaz, as well as Angie Valencia, for the nimble choreography to pull all this together and bring all of you together here today to talk about this event. From my perspective, certainly what's happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is as game-changing for the international system as we've seen perhaps since the wall itself came down. This is something we're really going to have to be nimble about and trying to understand what its implications are for the international system writ large, and also for our complex and highly hyper-connected world. And the lessons that I think we'll see about how this conventional military capability, we hope it stays below the nuclear threshold, but that itself is a risk, because of course we're dealing with the nuclear power. All this, though, is certainly bringing to the fore, a lot of mission that Tom and I share as passionately, and many of you on the call here, about the importance of advancing societal resilience in the context of disruptions, and both man-made and naturally occurring. So we really appreciate your spending this past hour with us here. And again, Tom, thanks for a brilliant presentation and sharing with us your extraordinary expertise and knowledge. And thank everybody for being a part of this today, and we'll continue to stay in touch.
Very good. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.